New business tonight, and the new business is going to be primarily the warrant.
Madam Chairman?
Yes.
Ask a quick question. Is it appropriate to talk now to union representatives here in Suffolk regarding Quinn Bill, or is it more for?
No, I actually was waiting for you to come. That's why I asked for citizens' participation.
That's what I figured. I kind of got the hint the second time. But
would you like to go back to citizens' participation?
If you don't mind.
No, I don't mind.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
If I can, Madam Chairman, there's been a lot of conversation about the so-called Quinn Bill.
Yes.
And with me tonight, I have Jen Braley, who is the president of the union, Patrolman and Sergeant Union. The Superior Officers Union couldn't be here. But we have the attorney also, Jennifer Smith, from the Patrolman Sergeant Union, as well as Detective Burial. I must say that in my years dealing with issues regarding collective bargaining agreements and so forth, I have never heard of committees being formed to go after a benefit that has been in place for so long, with meaning 20 or 25% cut for my employees. Now,
first of all, you're mistaken on that.
Yes, and that's what we need to clear up, and I appreciate that, because there are more stories going around about a quote-unquote FinCom Quinn Bill committee, and we need to at least clear the air, because I have 50 police officers who are pretty cranked up about it, and as anyone would be.
I understand.
So if we could kind of clear the air and talk about it, I think for the employee basis, at least that would settle their concerns.
Okay, and I'm going to turn this right over. Marilyn's not here right now.
No.
Okay, then, Tom? Do you have anything? You were on the committee, and basically, the committee was formed based on the the court order that came down recently. When the town of Wareham signed on to the Quinn Bill in 1974, the legislative body, meaning the town meeting, decided to sign on to the Quinn Bill, and the state, we would match the state's contribution. Well, in 2009, it is my understanding that the Quinn Bill, the state stopped paying for it. So the town has picked up the entire share. Our job as a finance committee is to let the selectmen, make them aware of financial situations that we are facing the town, and that was the reasons behind putting the Quinn Bill subcommittee together. None of us really understood it at the time. Now I'm going to go further to my colleague, Mr. Heath, that he can further expand on it, and maybe Mr. McDonald as well afterwards. And Tom.
The reason for the subcommittee was just that. There was a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of information that was missing, a lot of things that nobody was quite sure of, and we wanted to make sure that we got everything right, including discussing with legal counsel if necessary. What it basically boils down to, as Mrs. Frank said, on September 11th, 1974, town meeting passed a motion to adopt the Quinn Bill Educational Incentive Program. But also in that motion limited the town strictly to its portion, or basically 50%. As we know, the state came back and decided to stop funding their portion, first by a reduced percentage and then in total. All right. Somewhere along the line, on the town side, it was lost that the town was only authorized to pay its 50%. So they continued to pay the money going forward. But it was also the problem that there was the case that was sitting in front of the state Supreme Court, or going through the court system, regarding what the town's obligations were. All right. Our contract, as was written, I believe, in 2004, all right, which is still, I understand, continuously in effect because our last decision with the unions was based on arbitration, all right, refers specifically to the Quinn Bill. Doesn't have any other language other than the Quinn Bill, and applies exactly to the associate, the bachelor's, and the master's degrees. There is also an educational incentive for 2% for those with 10 college credits and 4% for those, I believe, with 40 college credits. Those are in no way impacted by anything going forward. The problem we came down to in April was the court came back and said, based on the language of the Quinn Bill, and that's critically important, based on the language of the Quinn Bill, the towns were not obligated to pay the state's portion. So now we found ourselves in sort of an awkward position. First off, we had paid for 2 years, when technically we shouldn't have paid for 2 years because we weren't authorized. But it had been lost in the, shall we say, the governance of the town. The people that were responsible to keep track of that had lost track of it, and we paid. But more importantly, what happened is when the court ruling came down, we said, wait a minute, that affects us immediately. Absolutely today. Right? And at that point, we had already spent the full amount of the town's portion as of April 2011 at that portion. All right. However, we continued to finish the year off. We started the current year, again, as part of our budgeting process, we looked at the educational incentive. The town is still obligated for, I believe, some $202,000. We have not reached that point, but we will reach it sometime in January. At that point, the town's selectmen have no authority to issue payroll cash because the town is not obligated. We have no authority. The selectmen have no authority. And it's not a negotiated item. The Quinn Bill is a dead issue. Education incentive might be a negotiable item. However, the Quinn Bill is not really a negotiable item. It's been ruled on by the state Supreme Court. Now, unless you find a way to get into the federal court and get the Supreme Court to go over and above it, that's the situation. All right? So what we did with our subcommittee was to find out what the story was, because we're going into a budgeting session again, and we know what kind of physical situation we're in. We also do advise the selectmen when we see them in jeopardy of violating state law. We already had problems with transfers last year. We're having lots of problems with the Department of Revenue. They are very unhappy with our accounting. They're very unhappy with our appropriations. They're very unhappy with our transfers. And they're very unhappy with our financial situation. So it was appropriate, in my opinion, for us to take a serious look at this and determine whether or not our selectmen were acting in accordance with the town's laws. And they are at this point, but will not be as of January. So at that point, we decided that we would issue a letter warning them that they were about to spend monies that they were not authorized to spend.
So is your contention, if I may, Madam Chairman, is your contention that on all unfunded mandates, including teachers and other things, that no matter what it is, all unfunded mandates, you're just gonna stop them all? Because the state's full of unfunded mandates.
If I may, Madam Chairman, our contention is the motion at town meeting was specifically worded to 50% of the education incentive. That's where we stand.
Well, I defer to counsel for the union now, because she's surely better versed in talking about collective bargaining rights and so forth. This community seems to be very much litigious in respect that we seem to go to court in a lot of issues that are foolish and end up costing the town a fortune. And I'll tell you one thing, this isn't gonna go away. Because I have 50 people up there, including myself, who everyone in this town depends on and put their life on the line. In the way they're being treated right now, with these kind of discussions, without them having any input, is criminal at best. Very frustrating for me as the leader of that organization.
Hold on.
No, can I please?
Let him finish, but I wish to respond when he's done.
Thank you. And I have a morale problem, and rightfully so, for the men and women up there who are trying to pay their mortgages, where this is all of a sudden just pulled out from under them. All of a sudden we hear through rumors and so forth that there's a move afoot, right? We should have been asked to be brought in, Labor Council should have been involved, and we should have had an opportunity to talk to you as ladies and gentlemen, rather than find out and see minutes of meetings that were floating around. Thank you, and I'm expressing what's coming from 50 people as well as myself.
Madam Chair, if I might.
Yes, you
I
may.
understand that the chief has 50 people who are very upset. However, if we pay money which we should not be paying, which we know the number now to be some $160,000, we're gonna have 22,000 other people that are gonna be very upset. I also understand their situation of paying their mortgages. I also understand that the people who will have to pay this benefit that's not been appropriated properly make, in many instances, an average, well, I know it's not an instance, the average income of this town, right, is 25% of what most of our officers make with their overtime. This is, so our job as a committee is to advise the town meeting in its budgetary process, and to also advise whenever we see a situation where money is going to be spent without being properly appropriated. That's where we are. Now, we have not at any point in our discussions used such terms as, I think this is criminal. So I take objection to that language. I would also say that in general business, all right, first off, this conversation was amongst us, the word did get out. We would love to have had you come in originally. All right, this has been on this committee's table for 2 years in front of the cameras, all right, in public. It's been discussed. Nobody asked us, nobody approached us. I personally talked with you about this exact situation, and nothing was done. So I have problems with that. We know that the Police Chiefs Association has also put out information on the court's ruling. We knew where everything stood in April. We should have addressed it then. In my discussions with the selectmen, you know, I have had a couple of selectmen that I've talked to. What I've said to them is you should have been brought in at the beginning of the year, because you might have even wanted to change how it was paid during the course of the year. All right, as I said before, educational incentive may still be on the table for negotiations. However, the Quinn Bill has been resolved by the state court. We've talked to legal counsel, talked to them the day after the ruling was made by the Supreme Court. And town council advised us at that time that we were not obligated. However, cautioned us that if we go beyond the point of appropriation, we might set a precedent that could not be reversed. So therefore, we felt, hey, we've got too many opinions going too many different ways. I would also raise one last thing. According to Chapter 40 of Mass Law 41, Section 41 and 42, all payrolls are to be attested to by the department heads, that they are proper before they're submitted for payment. I would ask if the chief has been attesting to that, and if so, did he consider this information in his attesting?
I think your information is dead wrong, and I take offense when you consider that our officers are making more money than the average citizen in town. I don't see everybody carrying guns, wearing bulletproof vests, putting up what these guys put up with on a daily basis, Frank.
All right,
And one last thing, if I knew there was a committee, Mr. Heath, and I was never told there was a committee, I surely would have been asked, I would have put the time in, I would have made sure that all unions were represented as well. Thank you.
Okay, let me just be clear that Mr. Heath is the former chairman of the FinCom and was very involved with this and has, as he said, we've been working on it for 2 years. Marilyn Donahue has been the chairman of this particular committee. And again, we're not out to hurt anybody. We just want to make sure that things are being done right in the town. It can go back to town hall, and as Mr. Heath says, educational incentives are still on the table. We're not out to hurt anybody. We want to do things right, and that's all that this committee is trying to do. It's not our decision. It's the people in Wareham's decision.
And I understand that. I didn't mean it to be contentious in that respect, but if there was a committee formed and we received something and said, hey, we're having a committee, we'd like to sit down and talk about things, that would have been fine. I didn't, yes, Frank and I have had a couple discussions.
Yeah.
We had a good working relationship with his chairman, but with the committee being formed, I think that we should have had an opportunity.
But the thing is, it is public, and it is public, it is on TV.
Donna, with all due respect, I don't sit home watching this.
So I got my turn.
No, I don't, okay, Marilyn's next. Go ahead, Marilyn.
I appreciate your passion in defending your offices. That's exactly what you should be doing. I don't think this is the forum that we should be doing it at.
I agree.
Okay, and it wasn't proper for us to invite you into the subcommittee. It was a subcommittee. We met briefly to review the legalities, the background, the history, and how we got to this point. It was a fact-finding committee. This discussion, and there'll be much greater discussion that will take place beyond. This is not the proper venue or the proper time, as we're faced with an October deadline for town meeting, and we have to get all of our articles reviewed. This is something, as Mr. Heath very eloquently and covered most of the points I was going to make, stated, we have been looking at this since the state stopped payment. I understand you have issues. Everyone has issues when their income's going to be reduced. But I think you're looking at the wrong people. I think we need to look at the state and why they're not paying. We have issues. If we're paying money that we are not legally supposed to be paying, we can be on the hook there as well. So there's a lot of different facets that go into this, all of which will be reviewed before any decisions are made. We are not a decision-making body. So it's a good place to get your practice arguments out, but ultimately this will go. We will make a recommendation that will go before the Board of Selectmen that may go back before town meeting. This is just the first step. And the subcommittee did whatever research we needed to do by talking to people that we felt we needed to speak with relative to the history, as I said, the history and the legalities of it. That is exactly where it came from. So certainly there will be further debate on this, but at this point I think we really should get to the business with our deadlines.
Okay, all right, I'll allow a brief comment from you and from Dominic, and hopefully we can.
Everything that we dealt with, or what the subcommittee dealt with and what we dealt with, is all public information. Nothing we had was secret information. It was all public information. The job was to be a fact-finding mission. We don't issue an opinion. We're not part of the negotiation.
We do issue opinion.
Well,
We don't need to.
but our job is, as a finance committee, is to look at the finances of the town from a budgetary standpoint. And this is a budgetary issue from our standpoint, because we're talking about a sum of money that is going to affect the budget. So that is what our charge is as a committee. You know, personally, I have friends, obviously, that are police officers, and people aren't happy right now, and I can understand that, but I still think there may be some misinformation flowing around that's caused it and made it worse. So at this point, we're not a decision-making body. We're dealing with public information that anybody out there can get. And we're putting together a report because it affects 22,000 people in this town, and that's what we did.
All right, is there?
Real quickly, has our letter of recommendation been issued yet?
Nope.
The board hasn't been put together yet?
It is put together, it's edited and it's ready to go to the Board of Selectmen.
Okay. The reason why I'm saying is, I understand that the town, but not that to be the buffer here or anything, but the people who are, it's affecting their pay. You know, I still think that they should have probably had some input into what we're gonna say. I know that we're looking at it as legal and bottom line, but sometimes bottom line isn't always right. You know, shouldn't that letter have some kind of input into what it is?
We don't have the right to make any decisions in this board.
No, I understand
We have
that,
the
and I know
right,
that.
we are fact-finding, and we are charged with watching the finances of this town, and that's it. We're an advisory board only,
But when the finances affect certain, okay.
okay?
All right.
David,
I'll let it go.
I'll let you comment briefly. Go ahead, David.
When we started this process, Chief, I think that most of us were absolutely in the dark on what was the state's requirement, what was the state's obligation, what we had to do, didn't have to do. But at some point, the selectmen have to be brought up to speed also. There's no intent to go behind backs. The intent was to find the information. Meetings were published. We put on our subcommittee for reports each FinCom meeting. We gathered some information. That information goes to selectmen. What they do or don't do with that information is going to affect you. But the point is, we advise them It's up to them to take that action. We, as a finance committee, are advisory to town meeting. Part of that is also advising the selectmen. We're doing that.
All right. Unless there's any other new information, I'm gonna let you speak. Did you have any new information, Frank?
No.
Okay.
So, just briefly, my name is Jennifer Smith, and I am an attorney with Sandra Leaguers, the firm that represents the patrol officers through their affiliation with MASCOP. Thank you for letting me participate, and thank you also for your diligence in researching this. It's obvious that you have spent a lot of time on it. And there are just 2 points that I wanted to make. The first was, I understand that this is an advisory committee and that you went on a fact-finding mission, and I think the information about the 1974 vote is really important. But what I'll add to that is that whatever the initially the town voted, the Board of Selectmen, who's the designated bargaining agent of the town through 150E, then bargained a contract with the patrol unit that says we'll adopt 150E and then we'll pay associates 10%, bachelors 20%, masters 25%. And I think that I agree that if the language just said we'll adopt Quinn Bill and pay our obligation under it, that maybe it's true that the town would, that payments beyond what was bargained would be in conflict with the Adams decision. But the additional language in the contract obligates the town to continue making the payments on the Quinn Bill at 100% until the town bargains with the union otherwise to modify the collective bargaining agreement. The Adams versus City of Boston decision, the SJC decision that we've been talking about, deals with very specific contract language where the City of Boston said, you know, we'll adopt the Quinn Bill, we'll pay our share, and if the legislator ever downwardly adjusts it, then we'll pay 5, 10, and 12.5% of the obligation of the Quinn Bill as an educational incentive because that's all that we're being reimbursed for, plus whatever money they give us. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, their contract, and what the case was trying to do was trying to say, well, you know, once you adopt the Quinn Bill, you have to pay the full amount whether or not you get reimbursed. And the city was saying, no, you bargained with us that we would only pay half. And the union was saying, well, that is, you know, we may have bargained that, but that's not what we meant. You still owe us the money. And the Supreme Court said, no, you know, absent a 7D requirement listing the law as an exemption from collective bargaining, anything you bargain can, you know, adjust the statute. And the statute says they only have to pay what they're reimbursed, and because they bargained language that says that, they're fine. In this case, the town has, it sounds like you feel, unfortunately, from your perspective, bargained to pay the entire obligation. And until they move on that, or until the parties reach agreement on that, that obligation still exists. I know that, you know, I'm seeing some heads shake, but the bottom line is that under Massachusetts General Law 150E, the parties have an obligation to maintain the status quo of their agreements until they reach an agreement to change the agreement. We have an agreement to pay the educational incentive at 100%, and until there's an agreement to do otherwise, that's the town's obligation. I know that you're going to send your letter to the Board of Selectmen irrespective of what I say, and I understand that. I think it's important to understand that it's possible that you're not understanding that's the state of the law, and that you might have written your letter based on an erroneous premise.
Madam Chair, if I
Yes.
may, we did this, you know, it was discussed with our town council, all right, and plus the decision was looked at very closely, and the decision did not require that it be part of the contract. That's why it was such a shocked everybody, because they thought it would be very finite to whoever was named in the suit, and it wasn't, it was beyond that, all right? And, you know, so we have a different opinion coming back from our town council, and that's probably something that'll have to be talked about. I understand we don't want to necessarily run up fees. I don't want to run up fees, okay? But we do have a problem, and as I said before, we are under the microscope with the Department of Revenue. And we just cannot risk any more situations where they come back to us and say you inappropriately spent, appropriated, or even recorded your financial information. We have real problems with the Department of Revenue. Right, and as I said, we have legal opinion that says this is the right footing, that we were only required. The contract reads only in accordance with the Quinn Bill. The court decision was based on the Quinn Bill language, so therefore the contract includes the Quinn Bill.
So, and
And so
I
that's
will
why I
say-
say you're gonna
I'll
have to
say
talk to
over
our
and
town
over again,
council.
that's patently wrong, but that's, the- you know, it is.
Exactly, and
Can I ask one, can I ask that, could I ask one more point too? The question that I guess is floated around also, that there might be an article at town meeting. The easiest way to solve this whole thing is for the town to have an article on its warrant at a town meeting that says, we're gonna pick up the unreimbursed portion. Okay? Now, it's never been ever discussed taking anything away from anybody. The only thing that's ever been discussed is not paying money that we're not authorized to pay.
exactly.
That's the whole thing. We have not even talked about what has been paid. You know, if I cut you a check on your payroll and I overpay you by $50,000, you don't get to keep it. You have to return it. Okay? Well, you know, we don't even want to talk about that. All we're talking about is the current. We're coming up on budget season. Right? The town budget is due in 45 days. And one of the questions we have to consider is what is going to happen in educational incentive. All right? And we know what that budget is going to look like. It's going to be pretty bloody.
It seems like there's no immediacy on the part of anyone then to sit down, not just this body, to sit down and straighten this out.
Sure.
You know, it's like this should be something that administration of the town is saying, hey, you're right, Frank, the budget's doing 45 days and so forth, and hey, guys, sit down, stay in the room for 3 days if you have to, but straighten this thing out in a collective bargaining fashion, and do it the right way, and come back and,
We don't disagree with you, Chief.
Can I finish up on that though, too?
We don't disagree with you. Again, it's not our decision. You know, we don't have the authority to do any of this. You know, we're just doing our job as people of the town of Wareham, as a finance committee. And we follow the charter to the letter, and let me tell you, I sat in that room with the Department of Revenue. And I'll tell you, it's not pleasant. They're not, you know, and they've got every right to be concerned with us, the way things have been going, so.
and Donna, you have my word, and Frank also, and I work closely with both of you guys
Yep.
especially, all right?
Yep.
I will make this a priority, get it straight, 'cause that's a valid point. I mean, the damn budget's doing 45 days,
Yeah.
and you guys gotta know if that 150 grand is in or out, or what's going on. So
Exactly.
I'll push that issue
Okay.
rapidly.
You know, Chief, to finalize this discussion, really, and of course you always have the last word, I guess. Your comment was, there seems to be no immediacy. That's why there was a subcommittee, that's why it was held in public. And they held their meeting was posted, held in public and recorded. All right, so that it would be there for the public record, because we saw that there was no immediacy, and we wanted to force it to the Board of Selectmen by putting a subcommittee together with a report and letter that said, you have to pay attention to this. It affects the lives of every person in this town, and it affects town employees. So if nothing else, you might say the committee appears to have been very successful to this point, and
Raising the
will
flag.
probably even be more successful by the end of this meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. No, I'm not. I was just gonna say, this is obviously well above, I mean, my head from a legal standpoint, but you're right, there was no immediacy. This should have been addressed months and months and months ago. Many towns addressed this before the ruling, and we just have never been proactive in this town. And now we're faced with a situation where we're the bad guys because we did what we were supposed to do. We have a fiduciary responsibility to look at the financial aspects of this town and the budgetary needs. That's what we did, and,
Okay.
you know, that's it.
Barring any new discussion, any new points, I'm gonna end this discussion on this. And I thank you for coming, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, moving on to the warrant, ladies and gentlemen.